All right. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully everyone had a terrific weekend. Today is Monday, May the 17th. I want to thank you for tuning in to a Gadfly live stream. Today, I'm here with London Paul of the Sirius Report. If you have not done so yet, please make sure to go over to thesiriusreport.com, bookmark Paul's site, and also learn about his premium content there. And don't forget also about our Gadfly multi-channel network, which is the gadfly.vhx.tv. You can also follow us on our social handles, one of which is Twitter, and that's at the Gadfly MCN. We also maintain a Facebook presence as well as a YouTube channel for some of our public content. Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, I'm very well. How are you, CJ?
Doing great, Paul. It's I think overall the weekend news cycle tapered back just a little bit. Thankfully, I guess we should be stating that. But it's still, regardless, it's still just very interesting current situation we're in with multitude of things geopolitically, Paul.
Yes, and obviously, there's many things to focus on, but we talked. I mean, I know you and Ken talked about Israel and what's going on with Palestine, and I did something, but it's worth talking about it in more detail because there has been developments. And also, really, again, it's one of those things that there's a tendency for us to look at things in black and white and then realize that this is extremely complicated and it's a myriad of shades of grey and it's extremely challenging to try and resolve the problem. That doesn't excuse the behavior of any of the parties involved, whether because on face value, what Israel's done since the inception of the nation is completely unacceptable. They're just, everyone's seen the maps where the Palestinians, the land they notionally is the part of their state is just diminished. And we've talked about the Gaza Strip, which is 25 miles by 7.5. It's got 2 million people living in it, and it's absolutely oppressive. And so there's no defense of those policies, but the point is there's an enormous amount of complexity in how we actually resolve this problem. Because at the end of the day, and I've said this before, missile strikes on either side and all this conflict, loss of life is not going to resolve anything. The people will look at it from different perspectives depending on their political persuasion or their ideology or whatever. But at the end of the day, this is not going to resolve anything. And one thing I would say is, and this is not defending Western nations' attitudes towards Israel at times where Israel breaks UN Security Council resolutions, and the world is very reticent to criticize Israel. Whereas if the Russians were bombing media outlets, you'd never hear the end of it. If the Chinese were doing it, you'd never hear the end of it, etc. But with Israel, it's a very muted kind of subject, and we'll come on to the more specifics of that in a minute. But one of the fundamental problems that is often overlooked in this is that Israel's a nuclear power. It has nuclear arsenal. We don't know how big its nuclear arsenal is because it doesn't even admit it has got one, but it has one. And that potentially becomes a major problem. So, and I'm not saying there's clearly people in Western political establishments, not just the United States, who are very pro-Israel and just for the sake of being pro-Israel, not because they're fearful of nuclear reprisals in the region. But there is certainly people who have a measured view of this, who on even the US side, on the Western side, will look at this and go, well, yes, we can be very highly critical potentially of Israel's actions, but in the back of their mind, they're fearful, well, this could spill out into a nuclear conflict. And if that does, then you got a major hot war in the Middle East, and where does it go from here? And that's an aspect to our understanding and how you deal with this should play a very fundamental role in saying, well, okay, this is unacceptable what's going on, but how do we resolve this? The first thing we need to do is stop this conflict. Now, that alone is going to be problematic. And having stopped it, then that's the point when, for once, the UN, there was Unfortunately, over the weekend, there was the UN Security Council mandate to try and not invoke in inverted commas, but to encourage and say, look, there needs to be a ceasefire, and the US opposed this. Well, that is extremely unhelpful. But again, we know there's all these conflicting interests in the United States in terms of its support with Israel. Not least, there's the Israeli lobby, which has enormous influence politically. It has enormous influence, not just politically, but in terms of corporations, etc. So we have to sort of factor in that there's elements in the US who go, well, if we lose that support, that could cause us enormous problems. Or there might be some enormous political shift that could cause us problems. Now, again, this isn't justifying any context. This is just the mindset of, it's not a simple situation where we just go, well, this should happen and there are no consequences for that. Of course, there needs to be a ceasefire. It has to happen a week ago, never mind today or yesterday. But the issue with that is how do you enforce that, and how do you balance the risk? Because even if we say, well, the Western nations are very pro-Israel and they're not going to say anything. The Chinese and the Russians go there and say, well, there needs to be a ceasefire, but they're very mindful equally that if you push Israel too far, and there is no doubt that this conflict has come about in the last week because Netanyahu's political position, we've said this before, is very tenuous. I mean, if they'd formed an alternative government, he would have been out of office. When he's out of office, he doesn't have immunity from prosecution for these charges that are levied against him. Whether they come to anything or not is not the point. So he's fighting not only his political survival, potentially fighting for his own personal liberty on that basis. So that's another factor that is probably significant in terms of what started all this off in the first place, because we'll go into again, it's worth reiterating what was a blatant provocation that started this whole process off. So these are things we need to factor into our understanding, but primarily there has to be a way, first off, of stopping this current conflict. And then having stopped it, we can't just kind of pretend to go, well, yes, there needs to be a two-state solution. There needs to be something where the world is going to have to grasp this, and the Middle Eastern nations are going to have to play a very fundamental role in this and say, look, whatever people's political persuasion is, whatever their ideology is, for once, the world is going to have to act responsibly. But the answer is extremely difficult. It's extremely complicated. And also, to some extent, I know people at times say, well, everyone treads on eggshells with regards to Israel, but a lot of it is because it has a nuclear arsenal. I mean, this is why when a nation has a nuclear arsenal, look at North Korea, they're not sure what they've got. Are they treading on eggshells with them? And they tend to just now go, well, they can just launch a missile as long as it lands in the sea somewhere. We're just going to ignore it, because the risk they fear is, okay, could start a nuclear conflict in the Korean Peninsula. This is ironically the reason why Israel's so frightened that Iran has that nuclear arsenal, even though Iran has stated it will never have nuclear weapons. It's because if they have nuclear weapons, it negates Israel's sort of strategic advantage to where the world's looking at Israel, going, well, they've got a nuclear arsenal, so we have to be extremely careful how we handle this situation. If Iran has nuclear weapons, for argument's sake, that changes the whole dynamic. Suddenly that neutralizes a lot of that potential threat that Israel poses, which means at times nations, and not exclusively, sometimes it's got nothing to do with it, but there are times when Western nations, and even the East, the Russians and the Chinese, are a little bit reluctant to push them too hard for that reason. Well, Israel then loses that strategic advantage from their perspective of having this nuclear arsenal, which means from their perspective, they're able to leverage things a lot more in their favor. Now, it's not exclusively the reason why that leverage is in their favor. We explain the significant links in terms of the United States to the Israeli lobby, etc., which has huge political influence and geopolitical influence and, of course, economic influence and financial influence in terms of the United States. So, and not exclusively that. So, there are things we have to factor in before we even begin to say, okay, well, what are the recent developments? What's gone on, and on that basis, how do they then start to address those fundamental problems? But if we don't understand that grey area that completely complicates, convolutes, confuses our understanding of how we approach this, then we can just go, oh, well, actually, we should dictate this and say this. And again, as I've said many times, the world's an extremely complicated place. Too much of the alt media trivializes things as though, well, this can happen, and this can happen, or this means this, and the world's controlled by this. And again, this is not how the real world operates. So, yes, there are frustration in certain quarters that Israel seems to have impunity to do what it wants, and that's proven. I mean, they've breached UN Security Council resolutions. They seem to be able to, whenever they like, bomb Syria, claiming they're bombing Iranian targets, and the world just stands there and doesn't do anything. Now, if any other nation did it, I don't think the reaction would be quite the same. So that is not excusing the way they've abused international law, etc., because, of course, they clearly have done so. But as I say, I think we have to start with that to introduce into this equation the complexity of what we're talking about.
Yeah, Paul, very well said. I mentioned to you this via messages that, this time, in my opinion, feels a little bit different in terms of the escalation than in years past. There's certain dynamics, many of which that you mentioned, which I think are a great assessment to say, hey, look, there's a lot more here to be considered than the standard plate. So not only do you have Israel potentially coming off a major shift in terms of support from the U.S. administration. We know that the Israeli lobby is very significant and funds and supports both Democrats and Republicans. But they're also seeing a turn in Syria, Paul. That's one aspect for them to consider. The fact that Syria, that Bashar Assad is not going anywhere. That the dynamics of Syria have changed. And now also with a pivot, if you will, to the Biden administration re-engaging with Iran and negotiations. So there's a lot of intricate parts to this and then also, which had been mentioned previously in the past in regards to the turmoil that Netanyahu is currently in. He's all in for this escalation, and it very well could be an attempt for him to, retain power and to once and for all an attempt to really cleanse Gaza, if you will, of the Palestinians, which will, by all means, if need be, they will potentially reach out to Hezbollah to help. And Hezbollah has, I think openly said, hey, listen, we will be here, but we will only become involved if we are asked to do so. So what are your thoughts on that, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, look, the geopolitical map of the Middle East is changing very significantly. I mean, you mentioned Syria, but in a very broader context. I mean, and there are a number of elements to that equation. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is an obvious one, where China's made significant inroads into the Middle East, not least Saudi Arabia is an obvious example. But also, Russia moving into Syria to sort of prevent effectively the overthrow of Assad. Also change Russia's sort of dynamic in that region. So they're two obvious things. But also, unfortunately, I mean, I have to say that, okay, the Trump administration went through this peace process. They had these Abraham Accords, and they said there were all these, Middle East nations were signing these sort of peace treaties in inverted commas with Israel. And I said at the time, they're not really worth the paper they're written on, because that's not going to engender peace. It looks cosmetic. Like it's resolving problems, but it's not. These problems are deep-seated. Now, the issue with all that is, from the mindset of Netanyahu, it emboldened him to think, well, I'm forming these alliance of nations against Iran, because Iran's his real problem. I mean, Palestine's is more of from his perspective, an irritation that needs to be dealt with, but Iran's his fundamental concern. So by signing these Abraham Accords, and him in his mindset thinking, well, I'm forming an alliance of nations to challenge Iran. It's emboldened him to the extent that he's now prepared to I think, take a more aggressive, assertive stance in terms of the likes of Palestine, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, given, or obviously it's an Arab state, and therefore the argument is, well, how does that figure into the equation with other Arab states in the Middle East? So that's a contradictory statement, but when you embolden someone like Netanyahu, then he's going to take a more aggressive stance in all manner of maybe even domestic policy, but certainly in terms of foreign policy. Now, does that mean there is an imminent war with Iran? Absolutely not, because the United States is adamant there is not going to be any war with Iran. But the problem is that doesn't mean Israel can't launch a preemptive strike on that basis. So there is lots of competing sort of ideologies and theories as to how you resolve problems in the Middle East. But the Middle East is an enormously complicated problem. But we are starting to also see rapprochement between the Iranians and the Saudis. They've had several meetings. That is going to anger the Israelis. Also, yes, we've had the Biden administration sort of looking like they want to re-engage with the JCPOA. Okay, there's some arguments as to how that transpires, and are they going to just rejoin on the basis of the existing JCPOA, or are they going to continue arguing that it has to be amended, and the Iranians are going to say, no, I'm sorry, that's unacceptable, and you're going to revoke all the sanctions the Trump administration put in place. But just in principle, the mere fact that the Trump administration walked away and refused to have anything to do with the JCPOA, and the Biden administration's come in and gone, well, we want to re-engage in this. And okay, there's brinkmanship and the usual diplomatic sort of shit show that goes on, and horse trading and all the usual things we see. Doesn't change the fact that that's unnerved the Israelis as well. I think undoubtedly, ironically, some of the Israeli policies has unnerved less the Middle East, but unnerved the United States. For example, China's got a big footprint now in Israel. It's got access to the Haifa port. That is deeply unnerved the United States. So there are all these kind of conflicting parts to this equation. And once again, it shows on the one hand, the United States is very supportive of Israel in one context, but they're deeply fearful of the engagement with the Chinese as another example. And in some senses, they're a bit anxious and nervous about the relationship between Israel and Russia in the process too. So again, it massively complicates our understanding. And the Middle East in general is going through its own evolutionary process. There's no doubt Saudi Arabia is moving away from the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia is embracing the multipolar world. Saudi Arabia is increasingly looking to sell its oil to Southeast Asia, and increasingly selling its oil, particularly to the Chinese and the petro-yuan. So these are all enormous geopolitical, geoeconomic changes that are happening. And of course, we saw with regards to the blockade of Qatar and how when the Saudis were instrumental in that, but that backfired on them, because all it did is it strengthened relations between Qatar and Iran, for example. So there's all these dynamics going on where this idea that Israel can construct a regional alliance to oppose Iran is simply not reality, because Syria is an ally, Iraq's now an ally, Qatar's an ally. And when you start to see the Saudis and the Iranians talking about rapprochement and going, okay, we're miles apart on many aspects of our international policy, but we want to start to have rapprochement and find a solution, then this increasingly isolates the Israelis. And so therefore, as well, all this Abraham Accords, what the Trump administration did, was just a white element, just cosmetic nonsense. There was no substance to it. It achieved nothing. And and people are going, oh, well, look, when Trump was president, we didn't have trouble in the Middle East. Oh, look, we're having trouble now. Well, yeah, that just proves the these Abraham Accords are meaningless. They don't actually achieve anything of substance, because Israel will continue to act with impunity when it sees fit, and it hasn't stopped launching hundreds of bombing raids into Syria. I mean, it stopped using Syrian airspace because obviously the Russians made it very clear. So then they started flying via Lebanon and were abusing international law using Lebanese airspace. So again, these are all just competing, conflicting situations that exist in a region of the world that's immensely complicated. I mean, we talk about resolving problems. I mean, the Middle East is making strides forward, but how long does it actually resolve all its ideological problems that exist internally within nations and then in a broader context? But there are encouraging signs, but we're a long way from resolving those problems. And of course, the more the broader Middle East begins to resolve those problems, the more fearful Israel becomes of its own position. Now, when we say Israel, we're not talking about the Israeli people. We're talking about principally Netanyahu and elements within his government who, and this isn't an excuse, are extremely fearful, almost to the point of paranoia about their own position and how they can be threatened. Now, that's not justifying anything they do. That's just a statement of reality. So that deeply complicates the situation also, because you can't, how are you going to sit down with Netanyahu and try and rationalize your way through this? Even if the UN Security Council tomorrow said, right, we're going to put this resolution in place, we're going to implement a ceasefire, we're going to send UN security force in, we're going to send, I don't know, maybe Turkey sends some into Gaza, sends some peacekeeping forces, maybe the Russians do, I don't know, we don't know specifically who would do that. But even if they did that, is that going to resolve things? Well, not necessarily, and probably it won't. So on what level do you begin to say, okay, look, there has to be a resolution here? And we're back to this fact that both sides firing missiles at each other is not going to achieve anything. In fact, all it's doing is leading to a loss of life, more so on the Palestinian side, of course, than the Israeli side. But these are innocent civilians. There's women, children, men, etc., who are all dying or suffering horrendous injuries. And this just emboldens both sides in terms of their grievances. And again, we have to start to reach a point where what are we going to do to remedy and rectify these problems? Because there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, I've seen interviews where there are a lot of Israeli people who are sick of it, but there are some Israeli people who are very hard line, who think the Palestinians should all go and live, in some other part of the world, and should leave Israel in totality. And they're very, very strong and vociferous in their beliefs. And equally, there's people in Palestine who are very, very anti-Israel because of what's happened. And these are statements of fact. And when people are that polarized, how do you bring them together? How do you actually begin to resolve these problems? And this is an enormous challenge. And the problem is the West doesn't even want to think about it. They're not even sat there going, look, we're going to have to deal with this problem sooner rather than later. We've postponed it for decades. We've turned a blind eye to things. Well, as you said, CJ, we've now reached this point of escalation in terms of what's going on. I mean, between the Palestinians or Hamas and the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. And that's, therefore, what do? Just wait and hope it just dies down again, and then wait for the next time it happens, and the next time. Well, no, this is one of the first occasions where the multipolar world, the new reality, which is trying to assert itself and saying we need to find a resolution to this. There needs to be the remains of the old reality, the unipolar world, which is the United States and some of its allies, who are going to have to sit there and go, look, this is no longer sustainable. And I do think within the United States, within the UK, within Europe, there are dissenting voices that are going, look, this is going too far now. We have to do something, but what do we do? I mean, because also there's this enormous fear politically that if you criticize Israel in any way, that you're anti-Semitic, and if you're perceived to be anti-Semitic, then your political career is gone. And again, we're back to this point politically. People are wedded to the system they believe in. They don't have anything else to believe in. They don't have any other career, and they go, well, once this is gone, I'm finished. So they're equally reticent to say anything that might actually make them look like they're very critical of Israel. Now, and I'm sure there's more people in the political system in Western nations who are fearful of that than we understand that to be. And what's certainly been the case is privately, at times, leaders in Europe have been extremely critical to Netanyahu in terms of his attitude and said privately, you're doing nothing to resolve this process. You're not doing anything to engender peace. You're not doing anything to find a two-state solution to this problem, etc., etc. But publicly, are they going to say this? Absolutely not, because they're fearful if they say things publicly, then their political career is over, and that's all they have. Once you take them out of the political equation, what are they going to do? They're just going to disappear into obscurity, and they're fighting to look after their own interests as much as anything else, which is completely wrong, because that's not how politics should be. But we know in the West, politics is completely subverted. It's corrupt, and it doesn't serve any of the interest of us as individuals. It's self-serving for its own ends. But as we've said before, and you look at what's happening in terms of the sort of geoeconomics of the Western world, the fall of US hegemony and the US dollar and the collapse of the unipolar world, is they can't change, because if they do a U-turn, they're politically finished. So they'll just keep plowing through the same ideology, knowing on a certain level it's all going to collapse anyway, but they have to just go down in flames with it, because they can't be seen to be the person who holds the hand that goes, hang on, this is all wrong. Because if they do that, politically they're finished. So they'll just take it to its natural conclusion when it all blows up and collapses, going, well, at least I can extract some value on a personal level on that basis. I'm not going to cut off my nose to spite my face, but it's absurd. But that's how the Western political system operates. So it does that domestically, it does that internationally, and there are many people terrified of being seen to say anything that opposes Israel, because the political fallout is their careers will be destroyed.
Yeah, Paul, it's very unfortunate, not only in this conversation regarding Israel, the Palestinian escalation, but it's very dangerous when we witness this, in a multitude, when there is an attempt to really shut down any type of counter narrative or attempts to question things, and rightfully so. I think this one that by several media outlets, several journalists were condemning, where we had the destruction of two very important buildings that housed close to 20 media outlets, that these buildings were taken down systematically by Israel. And those things should raise flags as to, okay, well, why is this happening? What's the attempt there to really, to shut down any type of reporting of boots on the ground? So again, we'll have to continue to, to monitor this. I also sent this article in regards to what Turkey is calling out of a quote unquote an international protection mechanism for Palestinians. There'll be several other countries that try to intervene or step in and try to, forge us ahead, Paul. But it just again, it just gets so conflicting with the multitude of things happening there. And let's hope that peace will prevail at some point, and the act of causing death and destruction can cease soon, Paul.
Yeah, we need to go into some depth this business about these, literally raising to the ground these media outlets of these two sort of high-rise blocks of or buildings. They're not flats or something. I don't think there was anyone residential in them, but yeah, they were both destroyed. And there's no doubt, if you don't have the Associated Press buildings in there, then you're not going to have the same level of reporting as to what's going on inside Palestine. Who does that benefit? Well, of course, it benefits Israel. So, it's a strategic move. They took down this Jahara Tower. That went down. Then they bombed the Al Sharuk Tower. They gave warnings before, and yeah, I don't know how long you've got, a couple of hours, get out. We're destroying the buildings. So we should at least be grateful there wasn't a loss of life as a result of that. But that's not the point. If you don't have these media outlets, they're there for a reason, and they're there because they can report on what is actually going on in Palestine. Although there's an argument how much of what is actually going on in Palestine is reported anyway, but that's not the point. The buildings are significant. I mean, they housed media institutions from all over the world, and the fact they were destroyed, is without any, fear of contradiction. And you can argue it's a war crime. It's against international law, but of course, what does Israel do? It says, well, the Al Jahara building was housing Hamas intelligence and military officials, and the Al Shura building was also housing military intelligence offices and their infrastructure to communicate, for tactical military operations. Well, of course, they would say that. And where's the evidence? Because people in these buildings said, I'm sorry, that's not the case. But again, that's just a tenuous justification, and we know why they're doing it. And I mean, the Al Saruk building's been bombed on several occasions in the last decade. So it's not. This is not like it's something new. We've seen it before, but I mean, it is a very, very disturbing development. And again, it's one of those things no one in the West is talking about it. The Western media doesn't talk about it. Western politicians don't talk about it particularly. I mean, there's some coverage, but it's a bit muted. And as we said, you imagine if there was Associated Press buildings in Iran bombed, or Iraq, or Syria, and if the Russians were behind it, or the Chinese, you would never hear the end of it. There'd be howls of derision. There'd be UN Security Council resolutions being called. There'd be sanctions wanting to be imposed against everyone and anyone. And and the point is, by doing this, it means now, where does all the press go? Well, I mean, they don't have offices, so they're not going to be reporting on what's going on. And it's a strategic decision made by the Israelis on a completely bogus premise, and it's appalling. And the West should be on this and saying, "Excuse me, this is unacceptable." And yeah, there are odd people doing this, but by and large, it's like it never happened. And again, the question is, why is the West so frightened to be critical of Israel? Well, we've said why. Because if people do it politically, it finishes their careers. If people do it in the media, it finishes their careers. And if they've been a journalist for 20 years, what are they going to do? So they're doing it to protect their own livelihood, to protect their own interests, because they have families. They may have young children. They're going, well, if I lose my job, I'm going to lose everything. I'll lose the roof over my head. So what do? Toe the line or lose everything? And people's personal circumstances is going to outweigh any of their actual belief in saying, well, this is unacceptable and we oppose this. And again, this is a fact of life. Put ourselves in that position. You imagine you work for a big news outlet, and you've got an enormous story, and you want to put it out there about what's going on in Palestine, in the Gaza. And you sit there and your editor goes, we can't put this out. If we put this out, I'm fired, you're fired. You'll be finished. You'll never have a career in journalism. You're sat there going, well, what do I do? Do I just push ahead and destroy my own livelihood, destroy my own family's future? What, do I take that risk? And people are going to go, no, I'm not prepared to do that. So the fundamental question is we shouldn't be blaming the media outlets per se. We should be saying, okay, you're part of the problem, but why are you doing this, and what can be changed so people don't feel so fearful of reporting the reality of what's going on in terms of this current conflict. I mean, but what, as I said, what really doesn't help is okay, Hamas is launching hundreds of missiles. Let's just flip this on this head for a second. The Israelis are going to respond to it. And they're not going to respond. They're going to respond asymmetrically. They're going to do what they want to do, irrespective, because they know they can do it with impunity. And at the end of the day, what is this actually going to resolve? for the people in Palestine? Nothing. Is it going to change anything? Nothing. So the question is, what is this actually going to achieve? Because militarily, Israel it has infinite superiority. Okay, the Iron Dome missile defense system is questionable, but at the end of the day, they have far more power and capability to do what they want to do. I mean, and largely with impunity. So how does this benefit the Palestinian people? Now, there's an argument that they're just so beaten up, broken down. I mean, the Gaza is an appalling situation, as I said before. I mean, it's appalling, in fact, is an understatement. It is absolutely barbaric. It's inhumane. It's disgraceful. So you can understand equally why the frustration that exists inside Palestine, saying, well, nothing's changing. Maybe this is the only way we can get things to change. It maybe ultimately, in the fullness of time, this might be the pinch point that changes everything. But there's equally the flip side that says, well, is it actually going to change something? So these are these competing sort of ideologies and theories as to how you resolve the problem. I mean, the other thing worth mentioning is obviously on the same day, Biden or someone in Biden's office, anyway, the Biden administration, inverted commas, spoke with both. Now, there's a Palestinian Authority president, that's Mahmoud Abbas. He also spoke to Netanyahu. Now, obviously, surprise, surprise, speaking to Netanyahu, he said, we defend, Israel's right to defend itself against rocket attacks from Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza. And obviously, they've condemned these indiscriminate attacks against towns and cities across Israel. Well, what else are they going to say? I mean, yes, okay, we can argue about what caused this, but by the end of the day, he's not going to say, well, actually, we don't condemn that. Whether, because they don't put context in things, that's just a binary statement. But he said, obviously, the Biden administration updated Netanyahu on what he called high-level US engagement with regional partners and discussing ongoing diplomatic efforts. Now, that is absolutely true. The US is trying to engage with a whole bunch of people to try and find some resolution to this. Because at the end of the day, what's going on between Israel and Palestine is of no benefit to the United States. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. So does it mean they're successful? Does it mean they're actually going to achieve anything? Well, that's an entirely different matter. But the one thing the Biden administration did say, they talked about the conflict claiming the lives of Israeli and Palestinian civilians, including children. At least there was an acknowledgement that on both sides of this conflict, there is unnecessary death. And obviously, and this is something we haven't come to, which is as much as Israel is extremely fearful of its neighbors, it's fearful of Palestine, it's fearful of Syria, it's fearful of Iran. There's also the point about what's going on internally within Israel, because there are consequences within Israel for Arabs who live in Israel itself. And there has been some pretty awful confrontations, violence, and worse between the Israeli people and obviously the Arabs. So that's something that was mentioned by Biden to obviously Netanyahu. So there is these violent confrontations that are also going on in the West Bank. And also the Biden administration, they want to enable the Palestinian people to have dignity, security, freedom, and economic opportunity in a two-state solution. So, okay, they've made the point. And to be honest, a two-state solution is the only answer to this. That doesn't mean the Israelis are in any position at this point to agree to that. Maybe in a post-Netanyahu world that has some legs. So there were certain comments made there, that's on public record, that gives you some degree of saying that even inside the United States, they've realized we've reached a point where something has to be done. Now, the flip side is he speaks to Abbas, who's obviously the Palestinian Authority president. Now, says he wants to strengthen the US-Palestine relationship. Obviously, they discuss what's going on in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, And obviously, yes, in terms of talking to Abbas, they talked about the need for Hamas to stop firing rockets into Israel. Well, yes, absolutely, that's true. I mean, because ultimately it doesn't resolve anything. Okay, we're back to this point from their perspective. They've reached the end of the line, so therefore they're just going to do it, out of desperation. Although there can be a whole bunch of other reasons why Hamas is doing what it's doing, but there was an agreement that innocent civilians, again, and children, lost their lives in Palestine, which is enormously regrettable, and obviously talked about the same way for the need for a two-state solution, and then a lasting resolution of this conflict. So, on some level, there's an admission inside the United States that this is a problem that involves both parties. Okay, there's an argument they may put more emphasis on the fact of the Palestinians' responsibility, but inside the Beltway, inside whatever we perceive the Biden administration to be, there's an acknowledgement that this is a major problem and it has to be resolved now. Because we can't just stand back and just go, well, nothing can be done about it. So we're just going to pretend that it'll all stop in a week, and then we'll just pretend that there's nothing happening in Gaza. There's no problems in land settlements and Palestinians being removed from their homes and demolished and being homeless and all the things that have gone on for decades. There is, I think, finally a point where there's a realization something has to be done, but who's the nation that's actually going to broker this? Because as much as the Russians can sit there and say, we'll host a conference between the Palestinians and the Israelis in Moscow, or the Chinese could do it in Beijing, or the Americans could do it in Washington, or the Germans could do it in Berlin, for argument's sake. Is this actually going to resolve anything? And maybe the solution to resolve the problem lies more with Middle Eastern nations who are going to have to take collective responsibility and say, maybe we're the ones that need to try and help deal with this problem. But again, there is no answer to this point. But the first thing, as we've said, is they need to stop this conflict. They need both sides to stop firing missiles at each other, because ultimately it's just tit for tat. What one does, the other responds, and at the end of the day, it leads to more suffering, more loss of life, more entrenched position. And in fact, the longer this goes on, it makes the resolution of the problem more complicated. It actually feeds both sides of this enormous divide in terms of their own particular attitudes, their own beliefs, and they become more entrenched. And at the end of the day, what does that resolve? Nothing. In fact, it makes the problem infinitely worse. And I think one thing we should talk about, I'll stop here briefly and you can speak, CJ, but there's the internal issue within Israel that something else we need to talk about, because this is, for me, a far bigger problem that is rearing its head now, but it's been in the melting pot for quite some time. And recent developments in this regard are immensely important that we mention this.
No, Paul, I completely agree on your assessment on all fronts in regards to the concerns, the multitude of things that are happening. And I think you're right. I think in terms of the internal part. So why don't you break that down for our Gadfly subscribers and those that are tuning in? Go for it.
Okay, look, we're in this scenario. I'm very talk about, like, don't put things in black and white, be too simplistic, but in very simplistic terms, we've got this tit for tat. Hamas is launching missiles. Israel responds. Hamas responds. Israel responds. And of course, what doesn't help is, Western politicians are going in very black and white terms. Well, Israel has the right to defend itself. Well, yeah, of course it does. But the point is, Israel's response isn't going to deter Hamas at this point. They don't need to establish any military superiority, because they're militarily light years ahead, in inverted commas, of Hamas. Where this becomes a more fundamental problem is what we've seen, these horrendous, like lynch mobs, there's been fighting between Arabs and Jews within Israel. That's the biggest threat to Israel's stability now and in the future, because I think already around 20% of Israelis are now Arabs, and that is only growing. I think they eventually think at some point the Arab population in Israel will be in the majority. Now, that's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it's going to happen at some point. So what does that mean for Israel if you don't resolve the problem now and start to realize that there is these enormous problems that exist inside Israel itself between the Arabs and Jews? Then you're going to only stoke up a massive problem that's going to happen in the future. So the problem is that obviously what didn't help was within Israel is there was legislation about 3 years ago that made effectively said that that the Jews had far more rights effectively inside Israel than the Arabs did, and of course this caused enormous consternation. But what we've seen is there is violence between the Jews and the Arabs inside Israel, and on a level that we've not seen. And when is this? Is this the start of something that's going to become a problem that isn't going to disappear? It won't disappear when Hamas and the IDF stop bombing each other effectively. So, and the question is, how does that get dealt? Because you're not only having a problem between two nations in Palestine and Israel in this case, it becomes a domestic problem internally for Israel. And we saw some pretty horrific graphic scenes of Israelis beating up Arabs. There was one vice versa, and in very brutal terms. And the question is, when is something going to be talked about? When are we going to start to go, look, this is now a domestic problem inside Israel? And I don't believe that domestic problem is going to go away. So Israel, therefore, suddenly has an enormous problem internally within its nation. I think also what is starting to become more fearful for the Israelis is, the younger generations inside, not just, in fact, just in Europe and America, etc., are now starting to look at Israel in a different light. I think it's happening within Israelis inside Israel. They're looking at this going, hang on a minute, we see things differently. I mean, we saw huge protests supporting Palestine all over Western. I think there was some in London, I think in Germany and various other places, the United States, where people have started to go, actually, we're looking at these things differently. We don't have this entrenched position. And therefore, that just massively complicates the problem in terms of how Israel deals with this internally. So it's one thing going, well, yes, we need to defend ourselves against Hamas's rockets, but when you have major problems internally within your country, and if you don't begin to address them, where does this go? When does the problem internally start to become an enormous problem? And we've seen in history how when you have divisions on that basis within a country, it can cause enormous problems. I mean, just as a simple example, we had all the problems in what was in Northern Ireland with the IRA, which was notionally supposed to be between Catholics and Protestants. I'd argue that that's a very tenuous reason for why it happened. But people were very much on each side of the fence, and there was enormous sectarianism, enormous problem. Things that if you told people, they go, I can't believe that actually happened, where you had neighborhoods where Catholics lived, neighborhoods where Protestants lived. And open discrimination on the basis of religion. And fortunately, things have changed to a significant degree. I wouldn't say the problems have entirely disappeared, but this is the kind of thing that on grounds of religion or ethnicity, when you have an internal problem, then it becomes a major problem. And how is that going to shape domestic policy within Israel? And how does it shape Israeli policy internationally, because again, it's one of those things. If a nation's internally falling apart, and it could be economically, it could be politically, which arguably Israel is suffering economically because of the pandemic or the response to it. It's suffering politically because it can't seem to be able to vote in a government. It just can't form a government because there's all these parties and the proportional representation system means it just collapses and they can't form any governance. Now, I'm no fan of governments, but if you have no governance in a nation like Israel, you're going to have problems. So there are all these internal issues. And if you started to add major conflicts and this kind of fighting between Arabs and Jews, and worse, maybe killings and whatever else that may end up happening, then that destabilizes the country even more. And what may that do? That might make the Netanyahu's of those go, well, an international confrontation might be our way out of this. We'll galvanize the people and focus them on that rather than all the internal problems. And that could be also one of the reasons why we've had this escalation of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. But this is something else we need to understand, because I always remember studying the history of the Middle East at school and thinking at the time, well, hang on, at some point there might be a situation where the Arabs inside Israel itself becomes the majority of the population, and what happens in that case in terms of how do you deal with the problem? I mean, because then the risk is suddenly those decades of all the problems and all the grievances that people, or the descendants of Palestinians who actually obviously stayed in effectively what became Israel after the creation of Israel in 1948, and disaffected. How are they going to respond, and what does that then mean for the Jewish people inside Israel? It's an enormous problem, and we need to start going. We can't just pretend and sweep this under the carpet. There needs to be some very tough decisions made, and there might have to be UN Security Council resolutions that are enforced to mean that we have to do something about this. We have to get both parties to the table and begin to resolve this. And how are you going to enforce that? Because I don't think, even if you got them to the negotiating table and you could manage to get some agreement, how is it going to be enforced? And is it just going to be 5 minutes after something's agreed and maybe there's treaties and things signed that they'll just be revoked and the same problems will rear their head? But I do think this is a watershed moment, and very likely there will be some long-term ramifications for this, hopefully in a positive way. And at some point there can be a two-state solution, that these huge differences that exist on a political level to some degree within the people between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but not entirely, of course, that these can be resolved, because peaceful coexistence is the only way for us to live and to exist. And it's just a pity that people, and as failed as the political system is in the West, they need to understand the ramifications of what this could escalate into in the future, and say we need to be bold and say we can criticize Israel where it's justified, and there isn't the risk that our political careers, our journalistic careers, or anything else are going to be destroyed because we dare to question what Israel's doing and be branded anti-Semitic for having the temerity to say, excuse me, but what you're doing with Palestine is unacceptable. And until we have that mind shift change, then it's going to be difficult, nigh on impossible, to resolve these problems. And also, we're going to have to sit there and go, okay, whatever your differences are, whatever your grievances are, whether we agree with them or disagree with them isn't the point. It's like whatever the situation is, you're going to have to face off with the enemy as you perceive them, your adversary, and say, okay, we've got to do something. We have to resolve this because it's not resolving anything currently. And that's the first step in a very long journey. But at the moment, we're doing nothing, and the West is actually compounding the problems with regards to Israel's stance, because no one has got the backbone to stand up and say, excuse me, this is unacceptable, except the ones who have done, of course, have suffered political and career, destruction, effectively. So we have to get past that point. Otherwise, this won't get resolved, and it will only escalate. And the risk is it could escalate into something that, we may look back in the future and go, well, if we'd actually done something, we'd avoided this problem. And, it's not the blame game. I'm not interested in, well, you started this. No, you started this. This is my perspective. We need to get past that. We need to be adults and say, right, you're coming to the negotiating table. I don't care whether you don't like this. If you don't start to do something, then we will take international action to impose things that begin to find a resolution. Whether Israel doesn't like that or likes it is not the point, because we can't allow this to continue, because at the end of the day, who suffers? People like us, families, they lose loved ones, they lose their children, etc., etc. And that just makes the situation infinitely worse, because then they're emboldened, their grief, their anger is going to consume them. I mean, if you lose family members because they died for whatever reason, that's traumatic enough in anybody's life. But if you lose them because of this conflict between two nations, many people will never forgive the other side for what's happened. And the more this goes on, that just entrenches people's perspectives on both sides, and ultimately, of course, they're all forgetting on some level that they're just pawns in a game, and they need to stop and turn around to these political entities and say, we don't want to be pawns in your game anymore. But that's, again, why I keep coming back to this point. There are no magic solutions to resolving problems in this world. It's a long process, but if we don't start on the journey, we'll never get to the destination.
Very well said, Paul. Paul, I want to thank you for a fabulous discussion today, and for those that subscribe to the Gadfly multi-channel network, again, thank you for doing so. For those catching one of our streams for the first time, jump over to the gadfly.vhx.tv. You can start out with a 30-day free trial there. After that, you can choose to either do $10 a month or save a little money with $100 a year. And then also, please jump over and visit Paul's work, which is over at theseriesreport.com, including his premium content, which are his daily podcasts, and my favorite, which are the double podcast days. So, Paul, this has been a lot of fun, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yes, very much.